Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 10th of October of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the Sudzha direction where the Russians began the second wave of counteroffensive, and as a result of second counteroffensive that hasn't been finished yet, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the territory between the village of Krymianoye, Olgovka, Lyubimovka and Novoivanovka, and the Russians managed to establish complete control over the territory between Korineva and the village of Zelyony Shlях. So these two blocks were colored in Russian favor based on the videos and geolocations that were published during the previous 24 hours. Now let's discuss in details because details are very interesting. First, the pro-Ukrainian channels, Telegram channels and Twitter channels reported that the storming of the Lyubimovka and the Kursk direction started during this morning of the 10th of October of 2024, and it was reported that about 30 armored vehicles the Russians were using in those attacks. Later we got additional video from the intersections of roads between the village of Lyubimovka, Zelyony Shlях and Novoivanovka of how the Russians were counterattacking the Ukrainians. As you can see, the clashes were taking place very far from the line of combat contact. And as for now, we haven't colored this territory in Russian favor because we don't know for sure where exactly the Russians were moving, whether the Russians were stopped or not, because we need additional details. Anyway, in this video we can see Ukrainian vehicle that was attacking the upcoming Russian forces, but when the Ukrainians realized that they had no chances to stop the Russians, the Ukrainians began retreating. And from the bottom part of the video of this episode, we see Russian vehicles that were running after the Ukrainians that were retreating. So the Ukrainians were running and two Russian vehicles were attacking the Ukrainians from behind. This event took place exactly in this area, in the vicinity of the village of Zelyony Shlях. Once again, the Ukrainian vehicle was located exactly in this point. His geolocation of Ukrainian vehicle was, let's say, geolocated. And the Ukrainian vehicle was attacking in the northern direction, trying to slow down the Russians that were moving along the road between the village town of Korineva and Zelyony Shlях itself. The Russians were moving along this road, and somewhere in this point the Russians appeared in the previous video, and the Russians began let's say hunting the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians were moving in the area of Zelyony Shlях. Somewhere in this point the video was stopped. So once again, as a result of attack, as we can see, the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt. The Russians managed to outflank the city of Lyubimovka and to block the Ukrainians that were located in the vicinity of the village by the name of Olgovka and village of Matveyevka. Later we got another video from the same direction, and let's take a look at this video. And in this video we can see several Russian vehicles that were regrouping, probably after very heavy clashes. On top of this personal carrier, probably this is BMP, the Russians raised a Soviet flag. We can see red dot right on top of the vehicle. And when the Russians finished regrouping, when the Russians managed to finish the battle with the Ukrainians along this part of road between the village of Korineva and the village of Sukhoy Shlях, the Russians began moving further along the road in the direction of Ukrainian positions. This video and the previous video confirm that the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt, to defeat the Ukrainians completely, and to begin the complete defeat of the armored forces of Ukraine in this direction. Furthermore, different mappers have adjusted their maps in the vicinity of the village by the name of Olgovka and Matveyevka. We're talking about neutral mappers and we're talking about pro-Russian mappers. According to them, the Russians also managed to take under control both two villages. But telling the truth, since the beginning of Russian second counteroffensive, we still haven't received even a single video that confirms Russian control over these two settlements. Most likely the Russians will be able to take the settlements during the next few hours, but I believe that there are still Ukrainians, and these Ukrainians haven't managed to escape the encirclement, and they were captured by the Russians or about to be captured during the next few days. Now let's discuss another important topic. I'll remind you that during the first Russian counteroffensive, during the first Russian wave of counteroffensive that took place since the that been taking place since the beginning of September till now, the Russians managed to restore control over the villages by the name of Vishnyovka, Snaga, Stepanasovka, Abukhovka, Nizhapne, Byakhovo, Viktorovka. So all these territories that are colored in red were restored by the Russians during the first wave of counteroffensive in the Sudzha direction. Then the Russians had a very long operational pause, and starting on the 9th of October, the Russians began their counteroffensive. I'll remind you that yesterday the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to restore control over the village by the name of Pogribki, and the Russians managed to restore control over the village by the name of Pokrovsk. So these two settlements were recaptured by the Russians yesterday on the 9th of October. And today on the 10th of October, the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt completely, to encircle the Ukrainians in the village of Volgovka, to reach the village of Noivanovka, Zhlyony Shlях, and most likely the Russians also managed to encircle the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian garrison that was located in the villages by the name of Nizhny Klim, Tolsty Lug, and the eastern part of Lyubimovka. So the significant number of Ukrainians, as I understand, were encircled by the Russians during the previous 48-24 hours. Of course, the Russians are going to continue. Once again, during those attacks, the Russians were using up to 30 armored vehicles, and the Ukrainians still haven't published even a single video that confirm at least minimal losses from the Russian side. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Kupyansk direction, because very important updates we are receiving from this territory. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainian sources published the video of how they were FPV droning and attacking the Russian forces exactly in this point. There are a lot of episodes of Ukrainian attacks. Some of them were geolocated, and one of the episodes took place exactly in this area. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map in Russian favor. Once again, as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to move further to the south from the village of Sinkovka and to take the northwestern part of the village by the name of Petropavlivka. I'll remind you that during the previous few days, since the beginning of October, the Russians were bombing exactly this territory. We see the line, we see Russian aviation artillery focus, a lot of strikes, a lot of explosions. Mostly the Russians were bombing this territory with different types of FAB. For example, this video took place on the 5th of October. Several FAB 500 arrived in the northeastern part of Petropavlivka. For example, in this video we can see that took place, by the way, yesterday on the 9th of October. We can see the main supply road that Ukrainians were using to support their force exactly in the area that the Russians managed to capture today on the 10th of October, and the bridge was destroyed. For example, today on the 9th of October, yesterday, we got another video of how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian positions almost in the same area. Most likely as a result of reconnaissance operation, the Russians discovered the positions of Ukrainian forces, and as a result of FAB strikes, the Ukrainian positions were destroyed. And during the previous few days, the Russians destroyed completely Ukrainian logistic on the territory of Kupyansk itself. So the offensive has begun. The offensive in the direction of Kursk has begun. Of course, there are still very far to talk about the clashes on the ground on the territory of city itself. Most likely during the next few days, during the upcoming weeks, the Russians are going to move further along the river of Snagast. This is the river of Gnilitsa. This is the river of Gnilitsa, and the Russians most likely are going to move along this road in the southeastern direction. Now let's move further. We have additional changes on the ground and additional progress of the armored forces of Russian Federation along the road N26 between the village of Krakhmalne and the city of Kupyansk and Kupyansk agglomeration. In this video that was published by the Ukrainians, we can see the Ukrainian FPV drone were attacking the Russian positions. Summarizing everything, we can see that from the northern part, the Russians are trying to reach this N26 road, and most likely they are going to move further in the southeastern direction from the village of Sinkovka. On the other hand, we can see additional progress on the ground along the same road N26 from between the village of Kotlarovka and Tabaevka. So most likely the next target and the main goal of the armored force of Russian Federation in this stage of the Kursk Kupyansk offensive operation is to take under control these fields and to force the Ukrainians to fall back from this territory as soon as possible. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Toretsk agglomeration. During the previous 24 hours, we got additional updates and additional changes on the ground. According to neutral mappers, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the territory between the mine and the tericon of Toretsk and the central citadel. So this is the progress on the ground, according at least to neutral mappers. I'll remind you that just yesterday we got report about complete and total control over the Balka block and the forest between the village, the city of Zalizne and the city of Toretsk itself, and today we got additional progress on the ground. Most likely the city of Toretsk is going to fall very soon. Now let's talk about the original Pokrovsk direction, because we received a significant number of updates from this territory as well, and the most important updates are coming from the city of Selidova. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. The first progress on the ground was spotted along the railways between the town of Tsukurina and the city of Selidova itself. The Russians, as we can see, are moving towards the village of Vishnyovo. If the Russians are able to get very close to this village, then the Russians will be able to establish complete FPV drone and complete artillery and even physical control over the last supply road that goes to the city of Selidova. Furthermore, let's take a look at this geolocation. This is very important geolocation because this video shows us how the Russians were attacking the Ukrainian vehicles that were moving between the city of Selidova and the village of Vishnyovo. This video confirms that the Russians have already established complete FPV drone control over this territory, but the Ukrainians still have possibilities to maneuver along these roads and maybe to bring additional forces or to conduct rotations. The closer the Russians are getting there, the less chances for the Ukrainians to save their vehicles and munition and everything that use these roads, the same roads. As for the eastern part of Selidova, we have another geolocation of how the Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russian forces exactly in this point. Based on this video, we have adjusted this part of Mikhailovka also in Russian favor. So once again, this is the progress on the ground according to different reports we received during the previous 24 hours. As for the Kurakhove Gornyak Cauldron, we haven't received anything from this territory, just one video, the episode of clashes in the southern part of Tsukurina. This video was published by the 59th Motorized Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine. In this video that took place 4 days ago on the 7th of October, at least according to different pro-Ukrainian sources, we can see how the Ukrainians were counterattacking the Russians in the northern part of Tsukurina, trying to slow the Russians down and not to allow them to continue their offensive. So once again, as for the 7th of October, this territory was already colored in Russian favor. We are talking the mine, we're talking about this territory between the village of Tsukurina and the village of Novoselidovka. And as for the geolocation, we see that most likely most of the mappers were wrong by coloring the southern part and this road in Russian favor. Most likely the clashes are still taking place in the village of Tsukurina and in the area around. Anyway, we're not going to change the map because once again this video of Ukraine counterattack took place 3-4 days ago. Obviously the situation changed completely since that day, but anyway, this is very important and very interesting fact. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation, and during the previous 24 hours the Russians managed to improve their positions between these facilities and the mine South Donbas number 3, and the Russians managed to improve their positions to the north of Ugledar. This information was confirmed either by neutral mappers and by video that was published by Ukrainian sources, Ukrainian soldiers on the ground. In this video we can see several FPV drone attacks on Russian positions. The Ukrainians, as a result of several attacks, managed to destroy the abandoned Russian vehicle along this tree line. Now let's move further. As for the village of Bogayavlenka, the territory of the settlement is under very heavy fire. Obviously, the Russians are preparing themselves before the beginning of the greatest offensive operation in the South Donetsk direction. And obviously, if the Russians are able to conduct several successful attacks, the entire direction can collapse. We are talking about not just about the village of Bogayavlenka, we are talking about the village of Bogayavlenka, Novoukrainka, Katerinovka, Antonovka, and probably we are talking about the city, the town of Kurakhove, the core of Ukrainian defense in the South Donetsk direction. Now let's move to the Zaporizhzhia area, and during the previous 24 hours we received a significant number of updates of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces. Seems that the Russians are preparing themselves to begin a full-scale offensive in this area as well. In this video we can see another Amur attack, and as a result of attack Ukrainian positions were destroyed. A little bit further in the north, in the vicinity of Dalinka, we see a few more FAB strikes on the village. Probably temporary deployment point of the armored forces of Ukraine was destroyed. Significant number of explosions, very heavy damage. Now let's talk about Dnipro, because today we got also very important video from this territory. The Russian sources, Russian official channel, published the video where they managed to discover the positions of 4 Patriot launching Patriot systems. A few seconds later they also published the episode when they managed to discover the positions of the command center and the radar of the Patriot system. Now, when the Russians managed to find out that this is real, let's say, Patriot system, but not something like a decoy, the Russians attacked this territory with the Iskander missile. Once again, as a result of this attack, the Russians managed to destroy radar, MPQ-65, the Russians destroyed combat control cabin, and the Russians destroyed the launcher of the Patriot system itself. Obviously, that was the significant loss for the armored forces of Ukraine. Now let's talk about the southern direction. The Russians continue hunting and destroying Ukrainian weapon of Western production that arrives in the territory of Odessa. In this video, according to the Russian author, we can see the port, and as a result of Iskander strike, another commercial ship was destroyed that brought additional weapon to the territory of Ukraine using the Black Sea and using the Odessa ports and Odessa port infrastructure. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.